In the mansions bright and blessed, He'll prepare for us a place.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling...
Chapter 14 and verse 66. Peter was below in the courtyard. Okay, so they've arrested him, and the council has, and the high priest says, "What further witness do we need? You've heard the blasphemy." So that's the thing. Now, under Jewish law, what was the consequence of blasphemy? They would be stoned. Now, I want to, and I know we talked about this a little bit last time, but I want to reiterate this again for those that might not have been part of that discussion, because it is pertinent to what we're talking about today. Why didn't they stone him? Okay, what the Romans did when they would come in and take over a place, they basically would allow you to govern yourself within limits. And one of those limits were they let you use your court system. But what you were not allowed to do is execute someone. And so there was a Roman prohibition. However, Acts chapter 7, that didn't matter. They stoned Stephen anyway. The leaders at various times brought people before Jesus. One very famous time, we caught this woman in the very act of adultery. Jesus' response is, he who's without sin, do what? Cast the first stone. In other words, they were prepared to stone this woman. What I would submit to you is that the evidence suggests that despite the fact that the Romans said, you can't put him, when it was done internally, I don't think they really cared all that much. There's something else that we have to consider. And there's two things that I think are worth considering. Both of them eventually get back to the Romans. But first off, what was Jesus's general station before the general population? How did people receive him? Okay, they viewed him as a rabbi and they gladly received him. In fact, just days before these events, when he was going into Jerusalem, what did they demand? That he be made a king. So he was extremely popular with the rank and file. If the Sanhedrin had put him to death summarily in an overnight trial, what would the population have done in response? They would have thrown a fit, which would have brought Rome's attention to Judea, because there would have been a problem. And Rome didn't like problems. So that's one aspect of it. They didn't do it because they knew they didn't have the support of the people at this point. Secondly, they didn't do it because the Romans directly were aware of Jesus. He was already on their radar, and this was a more high-profile case than the case of Stephen or the case of this woman caught in adultery, which they probably could have executed without the Roman authorities ever even knowing anything had happened. But if Jesus, who is much more high profile, whom everyone is aware of, whom everyone has heard of, and we're going to find out as we read this, Pilate even knows about Jesus. Who's Pilate? He's the Roman governor over this area. So the Roman government is very much aware of Jesus. That makes them handle Jesus differently. Just like our court systems today. Whether anybody likes it or not, it's the truth, and we have to realize it. If you or I were to get arrested for not doing anything and they threw us in jail, it would take months, years, who knows, we may not ever get justice. But if it's somebody high profile, people step in more quickly. Higher courts respond more quickly. Yes? Right. And so, and the problem is, he's guilty of a religious crime. He's guilty of a breach of Jewish law. He's not guilty of a breach of Roman law. And therein lies the problem. How do we handle this? We can't put him to death because then the Romans are going to scrutinize what we've done. How are we going to get them to put him to death? Which is what we're going to see actually takes place here, is they exercise a scheme. And their scheme doesn't even work. So as far as it pertains to the Roman authorities, so then in fact a shift is made and the scheme is exercised on the general populace. And so that's what we're going to be reading about this morning. Peter was below in the courtyard. One of the servant girls of the high priest came. Seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "You also were with the Nazarene Jesus." But he denied it, saying, "I neither know nor understand what you mean." And so he's gone to the fire, and he's warming himself. It's a cool evening. And a little servant girl walks up and says, "Hey, you were with him." And he says, "What? You don't know what you're talking about." Now, that's sort of easy to do because she's a servant girl. So, are they going to take her word seriously over the word of this free, established man? No. So that's all he does. No, but I don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what you mean. That's nonsense. He went out into the gateway, and the rooster crowed. Now, this is the first time the rooster crows. And the servant girl saw him and began to say to the bystanders. So now it's changed. First off, the servant girl walks up to him and says, "Hey, you were with him." And he dismisses her. Then he walks to the gateway of the garden. And she comes out, apparently follows him, and starts talking to other people and saying, "Hey, this man is one of them." But again, he denied it. And after a little while, the bystanders again said to Peter, "Certainly you're one of them, for you're Galilean." And so it moves from the servant girl. She spreads out, starts talking to other people, and eventually the people that are around start going, "Well, yeah, you probably are with him because you're a Galilean." And in another place we read, "Your speech betrays you." His language identified what part of the region of the country he was from, and they knew where Jesus had come from. Where was he from? Nazareth? In the northern regions of you're from this is a reasonable conclusion. You were with him. You did come down here to Jerusalem with him. And so that's the situation that's taking place here. But he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know this man of whom you speak." Now, this is a shift in the nature of his denial. Initially, his denial is, "You don't know what you're talking about." Now it is, "I do not know this man." It's an affirmative denial of any association with Jesus whatsoever. Keep in mind, just hours before, what did he say? "I'll die before I deny you." Now, a third time, he is He has denied him, and it's progressively gotten stronger. His language changes, the nature of his tone changes, the nature of his words change. I'm persuaded that the reason he began to curse and to swear, as it's talked about here, is in response to your speech betrays you. He was trying to distance himself both in his behavior and his speech so that his denial was more plausible. He was acting unchristlike so that I do not know this man becomes more believable. I do not know this man of whom you speak. And immediately the rooster crowed a second time. And Peter remembered how Jesus had said to him, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. And I'm going to ask you a question. You can answer it out loud. You can not answer it out loud. I don't care. You can answer it within your own head. That's fine. Have you ever been in a similar situation to Peter's where you have said something or done something and then stopped and remembered, the Bible says this, I should not have done this thing, and then felt bad about what you had done? That's what Peter did. But I want you to notice that this was not just a, man, I feel bad. It says he broke down and wept. Yep. That's another dimension to this. What made Peter remember was actually eye contact with the Lord. That and I don't know how long that eye contact lasted. It could have been momentary. It could have been seconds. I'll guarantee you it felt like a year. Because he made eye contact with the Lord and remembered the Lord's words. Which, by the way, brings up something else that I can drag into this. Before he made eye contact with the Lord, apparently he didn't remember what the Lord had said. Because it says he remembered, which means that he had forgotten. He had put it out of his mind. Of course, that makes sense, because at the time that it was said, what did Peter believe? It would not happen. So he didn't take stock of that and say, okay, I knew. He was convinced it wasn't going to happen. So he just kind of dismissed what was said. What made him remember? Being close to the Lord. That contact. I would submit, for purposes of our consideration, that is absolutely true for us as well. When we are living our daily life and we're out there in the world and it's easy for us to forget things. What makes us remember those things? Association with the Bible. Opening up and reading. Keeping the instructions of God close to us. Prayer. Keeping that relationship and that communication with God close to us. The association we have with one another. You'll recall Hebrews 10 tells us not to forsake the assembling of ourselves together. For what purpose? Well, it's specified in verse 24 to consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds. Our association with one another and encouragement and the accountability we have toward one another keeps these things in our remembrance. Reminds us of things that we might have forgotten. If we just go out into the week and never access any of these spiritual disciplines that tie us back to these instructions, how long do you really think you're going to remember what it says? Yes, sir.
David said, your word I've hidden in my heart that I might not sin against thee. That's exactly what we're talking about here. Because we would do well to emulate that, because that is how, as the New Testament writer said, we let the words of Christ dwell in us richly.
Yeah, and I have hidden in my heart doesn't mean that I keep them private and I don't talk about them. That's not his point at all. that passage of David. What that passage of David is talking about is what? I keep it close to me. I keep it active within me, not dormant, but I keep it in my heart, in the inner man, in me. That awareness of what God has said is what drives. And by the way, is guilt a bad thing? No. What is the purpose of guilt? Why do we have, we're built with a sense of guilt and shame. Why do we have that? To help guide us. And that's exactly what happens here. Peter breaks down and begins to weep. Why? Because he realizes that he has done something wrong. He realizes that he's weak and he failed to do the thing that he was so adamant that he would do even unto death. Very interesting. I'll also mention, though that was hours before this, what we probably would catalog as minutes before this, what else had Peter done? He had drawn his sword and been ready to go into battle. He was a lot impulsive, which makes me feel better. But it's not like his dedication and purpose and intent had changed. What had changed was it had become personal. Hey, you were with him. Hey, this guy was with him. Why would she be telling the bystanders? Why would the bystanders begin to question him? Why would this even be brought up? Why would it matter? Because the likelihood of getting drug in. Listen, if Jesus has done something wrong and you were with him doing everything with him, then what else is true? You are participant. And so if Jesus is going to be arrested and tried, then what should happen to Peter? He should be arrested and tried. But if he denies knowing him and says, I don't know what you're talking about, and they don't have the way to make that connection, then what happens to Peter? Well, the same thing that happens every day in our court system, where there are multiple people involved in something, and one of them gets caught and the other one doesn't get caught, and the guy that gets caught a lot of times says, hey, he was with me, because we don't like to be punished by ourselves for some reason. It's kind of weird, but we don't. And then they come, and if they can't make that connection, the second one skates. And by the way, there's a lot of animosity between people who do crimes together as a result of that. But that's it's self-preservation. And this is the important part about this. Here's Peter, who was with Jesus for 3.5 years. He was part of the inner circle. He saw the transfiguration. He was there with the prayer incident that we read about a couple of weeks ago. He was one of the guys that had more information than anyone else. And self-preservation caused him to sin. Don't think it won't cause you to sin. What's the number one reason why people lie? Self-preservation. Oh, I would never be a liar. I'm not a liar. I wouldn't lie. When it's between getting in trouble and not getting in trouble, people lie every day. And they justify it in their mind. Peter was justifying his behavior in his mind until he remembered what the Lord said and he realized what? I'm wrong. And if we ever get to that point that we aren't drawn back to what God has said and we don't have a penitent heart in response to it, that's when we're in trouble. Peter is restored. Not quite yet, but soon will be. Yes.
cross, it wouldn't have worked if the people decided to kill Peter instead of Jesus.
It might have and could have and possibly, but it didn't. And it also could have kept Jesus from going to the cross altogether, because while the crowds could be persuaded to ask for one death, they might not have been willing to ask for 13. Or in this case, 12, I guess. Judas had left. So, but the might have and perhapses are not nearly as important as the what is. And this is what is. And what we learn from what is that you or I could just as easily deny Jesus when we do it to preserve ourselves, or our reputation, or our job, or whatever else. When I was a teenager in high school, I didn't advertise that I went to church regularly. Anybody want to hazard a guess as to why I didn't advertise that I went to church regularly? It made it a lot easier at school. I let people believe whatever they wanted to believe about me. Made it a lot easier. What's the difference? Well, the answer is there is no difference. We can do this just as easily as Peter, and we do it. So we have to keep that in mind. Sometimes you do get drug into the fray and you go to the cross with him, metaphorically speaking. If you stand with him, if you continue to identify with him. As soon as it was morning, chapter 15 opens up, the chief priest held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council. They bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. We already mentioned that Pilate's the Roman governor. So rather than do anything themselves, which they are willing to do in other circumstances, they deliver Jesus to the Romans. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Wait a minute. I thought it was blasphemy that they found him guilty of. What's this "are you the king of the Jews" question? Where's that come from? Yeah, we've got to get the Romans mad at Jesus. Do the Romans care that he's blasphemed the temple or blasphemed God or blasphemed Moses or blasphemed any of the other things that they were concerned with him blaspheming? They don't care. Guess what the Romans would do? Speak evil against those things right with him. That doesn't bother them. That's not against their law. They're not going to do anything. So instead, they say, he's an insurrectionist against Caesar. Are you the king of the Jews? He answered them, "You have said so." The chief priest accused him of many things. What does that mean? They accused him of many things. Well, the obvious thing is this. They threw out anything that they thought they could throw out, that they thought would irritate their own. And eventually, if enough people are saying enough things, it poisons the mind of the judge and they think, well, this is a bad guy. And so that's what they're doing. The whole council is going, hey, but he's this and he's this and he said this and he. And Pilate again asked him, have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you? But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. Now at the feast, he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked, and among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection. So this is an active insurrectionist who actually murdered someone during the course of an actual insurrection. There was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. So the crowd at this point is just asking Pilate to do what? You usually on the feast day release a prisoner to us. Would you do that? Are you going to do that this year? He answered them saying, do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? So Jesus has just been brought to him. The crowd's starting to assemble. The crowd says, hey, wait a minute. Usually you release somebody, and he goes, solution. How about this guy? You want me to release him? He perceived, listen to this, Pilate wasn't stupid. He perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priest had delivered him. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. It wasn't working. Pilate wasn't on board. So we're going to quit lobbying Roman charges against him. And we've got to stir up the crowd and get the crowd demanding someone else, or Pilate's going to say, Jesus, I released Jesus to you this year. And so they start stirring up the crowd, demanding that it's Barabbas. Pilate again said, then what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews? What? Okay, if you want me to release Barabbas, but then what do I do with this guy? They cried out, crucify him. He didn't. But he's kind of in a predicament now because the masses are now demanding Barabbas instead of Jesus. And if he goes against their will, he's back at the problem that the Jews were concerned about. Now the people are going to make a stink about that, and that's going to attract Rome. And the whole goal of a Roman governor is to do what? Keep it as quiet as possible. I got a good gig here. They give me a nice house. They give me some nice money. All I got to do is keep things quiet. Pilate said to them, why, what evil has he done? Now they're demanding him to be put to death, and he says, what's he done? He clearly hasn't bought any of the charges, including his desire to be king. He's heard no evidence. He's seen no reason to believe it. What he knows about Jesus doesn't. He's like, on what basis am I going to crucify him? But they shouted all the more, crucify him. Now, the next thing I'm going to tell you is these are some of the same people who were throwing their coats and palm leaves down the ground as he came into Jerusalem just days before saying, be our king, that are now shouting, crucify him. How does that happen? That is how powerful the bandwagon effect is and how easy it is to get caught up in the popular will. Don't think that it can't happen to you or me or any one of us. It can.
There's a lot of studies that show people violate their moral standards in a crowd or group situation.
Yep. There's all kind of great studies along those lines. They can make people hurt people just by social pressure. Don't think that peer pressure is only for teenagers. Peer pressure is for all of us, and we are part of it. As we march through life, and we are a part of the society that we're a part of, don't think that the will of the people isn't influencing the way that you think and behave. That is why it is so important to regularly consult what God has said, because you will start thinking the way the world thinks. And this is a demonstration of how drastic the change can be and how quick. From, we want you to be our king, to crucify this man, just took some people from the council saying, hey, we need to do this. And them going, okay, give us Barabbas and crucify him. And Pilate going, "Nah, I don't really want to do that." And them going, "Hey, we asked for Barabbas. We want you to crucify him." And that became a, "Don't tell us. We're going to make our demands." And they began to yell, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, again, because he's trying to do what? Keep peace. Released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Now, I'm going to stop there for just a moment. Don't really want to, but there's an important thing I want to look at here. Go to Acts chapter 2 for a second. We want to notice some of the language of Peter's sermon there. Look, starting in verse 22, the opening, he says, "Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst." So he reminds them first of what? The teaching and the miracles that Jesus performed, that the people that were assembled there had themselves heard and witnessed, which he did in your midst, as you yourselves know. This Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of, this translation says, lawless men, which means what? Not that they didn't have a law, but what? They were not Jews. They weren't functioning under the law of Moses. That's what lawless means here. Some translations will say, you crucified and killed by the hands of ungodly men. In other words, he tells a group of Jews, you killed him, you just used the Romans to do it. That's a significant thing, because that's exactly what plays out here in the Gospel of Mark. What did the Roman judgment on Jesus come down to? What evil has he done? I find no guilt in this man. He's done nothing worthy of death. That's what the Roman judgment. The Romans didn't crucify Jesus in the sense that it was their judgment against Jesus. The Jews did it by the hands of the Romans. And not really all the Jews. Just the council and the crowd that they were able to work up into a furor. What we need to understand is there's plenty of guilt to go around. Judas betrayed Jesus. Is he guilty? The council took false charges against Jesus. Are they guilty? The council made false charges against Jesus. The crowds demanded his death. Pilate knew he was innocent and put him to death anyway to keep the peace. The Romans let it all happen. Who killed Jesus? Did you notice there was also a line in there, Peter said, which happened according to the predetermined plan? Who made that plan? God. Why was Jesus on the cross? It really wasn't because of the Jews, and it really wasn't because of the Romans, and it really wasn't because of the crowds, and the reason Jesus was on the cross is because we sinned. Me, you, all of us. Because God knew that the only way that he could redeem any of us is to make a sacrifice. And centuries before it happened, he told people it was going to happen, and then did something really interesting. By the way, people miss out the focus on this. He introduces the idea in several different ways through the prophets that he is going to be crucified. Okay? Crucifixion was unheard of at the time, and it was not part of what the Jews did. Why would he be crucified? Why was that the plan of God? So that when it played out, people could look back on it and say, this is what Joel wrote about. This is what Isaiah wrote about. This is the fulfillment of prophecy, and that means that when John said, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away his sin, he was right. To identify that it was God's hand and that it was God's sacrifice, so that we would know that he was the Son of God. And so all of this happened to fulfill the prophecy that came from God. And it was so I could have the opportunity to repent and be delivered from my guilt. The soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters. They called together the whole battalion. Yeah, because he was such a powerful man and so well armed and had so many friends at this point. Where were his friends? He had 12 of them, right? Well, he had 120. Let's be broad. He had 120 friends. Where were his friends? Scattered. Saying, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know that guy. When he actually goes to the cross in a little while, how many people are actually there? I think there's 3 that are named. 2 women and John, who are there but at a distance. Out of 120, there's 3 that are still around, but following at some distance so that they don't get caught up in the melee. But they bring in a battalion of Roman soldiers. They clothed him in a purple cloak and twisted together a crown of thorns, and they put it on him, and they began to salute him. Hail, King of the Jews! And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. Do you notice that Mark doesn't record the scourging and all that kind of stuff the way that some of the other Gospels do? It's interesting to me. It says having scourged Jesus, but that's as much as it says. It doesn't tell us anything about that experience or what it involved or how long it lasted. There's actually very little focus in the Bible given to the treatment of Jesus. And most of that focus is given to the mocking and the derision and the he saved himself. I mean, he saved others, he can't save himself kind of stuff. And if you go to Hebrews 22, we read that his heart melted within him. The greatest tragedy of the cross was Jesus being left alone and having to process all of those things without any of the comfort and support of friends and family. Got to stop. Verse 21 of chapter 15 next time.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be when we all shout the victory.